Well, when I was working and assigned to crises somewhere in the world, I would always seek out people like our guest on this edition of the podcast. Canadians with enormous and injured hearts who are drawn to help in places they don't really need to be, but they can't imagine being anywhere else. They often work for charities, medical organizations, or other non government organizations, bringing their unique skills to conflict zones and trying to heal broken or breaking societies. To a foreign correspondent, they were generous sources of reliable street level information. They felt the places they were in. They could sense its flow. They knew where danger had established itself. Kate McKenna is one of those people. She's been in Ukraine for months now, maybe years, mostly helping establish and expand a defense against the complex information warfare challenges that society has endured for more than a decade. Russia tests its latest and most destructive cognitive warfare abilities against Ukrainians and has for a very long time. So, how they have endured, remained cohesive, and kept a sense of themselves is something that Canadians can learn from as we become more entangled in superpower conflict. And Kate has been the Canadian closest to that effort there. She's with us in Kyiv. Hi, Kate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, it's been a very hard period for Kyiv over the last couple of days. There's huge air attacks. How is your personal resolve holding up through it all?
Oh, it's okay. I have, as you can hear, I don't know if you can hear it, but the two dogs behind me are scrapping, and I have two cats in front of me. So, um, you know, it's definitely hard, especially because the attacks are always at night when everybody's asleep. I live in central downtown Kyiv under air defense on purpose, but a lot of most people don't, and especially since Trump is refusing to allow us to get any more Patriot missiles to defend Kyiv and other cities with. It's very difficult. Pretty much the 50 cals that are sitting on top of buildings around us are going pretty much all night. So last night the wave of attacks was 6 hours long, um, and shaheeds. But the other two nights we had cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And if you're going to be hit with a ballistic missile or a cruise missile, there's nothing you can do. It's just you're dead.
What? I haven't been in that intense of a situation before. I mean, to have no control over what's happening to you in the next half hour, it
Mm-mm.
must be mind-boggling.
No, yeah, no, yeah. But the one thing I love about Ukrainians is how resilient they are. They never ever feel sorry for themselves. The first night that was really horrendous and ballistics killed, I think it was 7 children. And the devastation was enormous. People were out in the park. They were singing songs. I'm sorry, quit it.
That's fine. It feels like normal life, which is
Sorry.
a nice.
Um, I'm very lucky that I live right close to the main university, and there's a beautiful park there, and there's always musicians playing. And for the last 3 days, they've been playing very Ukrainian nationalist songs, and it's inspiring.
Yeah, it's
The
often the
resilience
case,
of
and
something else. Yeah.
it's funny the role that music plays in unification and settling people's souls at a time like that. You've seen that in many places in the world, I'm sure.
Well, and especially because Russia tries to ban those songs, right?
Hmm.
They've tried to wipe and erase the Ukrainian songs, Ukrainian culture. They've tried to erase it from the world, and that is their purpose. They want that, and
So
yeah,
resilience and defiance. It's a pretty
yes,
powerful, potent combination right there.
yeah.
But what I wanted to talk to you about specifically, because of your sort of unique perspective on this, is sort of another aspect of this very long war that Ukraine is enduring. And that's the attacks that Russia has been waging, as I said, for more than a decade on Ukraine's
Mhm.
information system. And it has been at a scale that I don't think Canadians have any experience with, of course. But we are starting to see.
Argue about
All
that.
right. Okay. Well, not at the scale, though. Like, we haven't
um,
seen it at that scale.
no, but you have seen the Chinese. If you're in the Chinese community in Canada, you're exposed to an awful lot of it. And I think that it would be a misrepresentation for us not to talk about the alt right, the MAGA, and those attacks in the Canadian space since July 2024.
Okay, so we are going to talk about those, and I do want to break those down because, as you say, we are starting to see similar attempts to sort of shape our conversations in Canada through influence campaigns from Russia and others. But um, can we start at the beginning of your journey a little bit and how you were drawn to it in Ukraine and what kind of role you have played? I'm really interested in building a defense to it
Mhm.
because,
Yeah.
when it's been something that the Russians have, terrible word for it, but it's true, innovated in. And in many cases, Ukraine has been at the front line of trying to figure out how to defend itself against it. How are you drawn to
Well,
that?
so I was volunteering for digital transformation in the Army of Drones, and I've done that since March 2022. And I got pulled in by a a couple of people who were setting it up for a defense intelligence Ukraine. So Ukraine is a really interesting, very flat structure. It is unique, I think, in that, and that's one of the reasons they've been able to defend themselves so well, is it's decentralized, and it's a very I call it horizontal relations, which
Mm-hmm.
also makes me laugh, but so it's extremely flat. Everybody, if I wanted to speak to President Zelensky, I could with a couple of phone calls. That's just how this society works, and it is a very powerful. So people mentioned my name, and I was approached and asked if I would set up this initiative. One of the issues that Ukraine faces is underfunding. And we're up against an enemy that is extremely well funded. And the idea was to try to ask our allies, and Canada in particular, if they would mind giving us $2 million to create the technology and the system that would scale. And that's the biggest thing to understand about this is scale. Currently the West and the the defenses are this when you've got this huge wave just coming and just sweeping across. In the first Romanian elections, I think it was the Romanian elections, might have been the Moldovan, um, they spent $60 million just like that,
Mm-hmm.
on disinformation, information warfare. The Ukrainians don't have that sort of funding. And so one of the key issues is always funding, but also scaling the reaction, scaling the ability to identify, to scrape data from the social media platforms, and build a predictive and preventative model. So building things that can predict and then prevent, because once a campaign has started, then you're on the back foot and you're fighting all the way. So the holy grail is to identify, predict, and prevent before it even begins.
So I find that interesting because if the expectation then is that like government will come up with a solution in its typical hierarchical way, that's not really going to be a solution. Ukraine teaches us that it has to be decentralized. Um, Citizens have to be empowered to come up with the solutions, and then they have to have a clear roadway to basically execute and try to scale them. In other words, government kind of has to get out of the way.
Well, government has to provide the funding, has to provide the infrastructure and the support, but it is a hybrid warfare. And so you have to take it. And unfortunately, the West is very siloed in their defense and intelligence systems. And that does not work. You
They
can't
don't they
have
don't share they don't share it with us. They keep it closed in.
Yeah, and everything is about, especially if you're in the intelligence or security community, people really, especially Canadians, I've found in this community, are horrified the fact that I openly say, "Hey, yeah, I work for Defense Intelligence Ukraine."
That's
And
twice you said it now.
yeah, exactly, right? So I think they got the message.
Yeah.
And why? Because we have to be transparent. We're fighting a hybrid warfare, and if you're not able to talk, and you're not talking to your colleagues, and you're not sharing the intelligence, which is what they don't do, and if you're fighting over turf wars because that's my mandate and I'm not going to share it with you, you leave your citizens vulnerable and you're not doing your job. And that's what we found. In April 2024, when we obviously approached our sister agencies, allied agencies, and they would say, well, I've got this bit, but Colin down the corridor, he's got the other bit, but we don't talk to each other because we can't. So everything goes up this way, but nothing goes across this way. And you can't fight this war doing it that way. You can't. You have to be open. You have to be communicating. It's critical, and you
And,
have to
and, you,
share.
and you have to be committed to innovation, not
Mhm.
process.
And you have to adopt OSINT. Um, and I find that the Western intelligence agencies are being very slow to understand the power of OSINT.
What
Open
is
source,
OSINT? Can you explain that to me?
open source intelligence.
Right.
The power with, I mean, I've watched my colleagues, and actually I just met some new colleagues today who are incredible in terms of their understanding of the Russians, how they operate, from the top all the way down, the 73 countries in which they operate these hybrid warfare, the misunderstanding of the West when they look at something like Wagner and not understanding just how deep those operations are and how they are intertwined between an NGO and a fighting force and human trafficking and disinformation and cyber, and all of those things are interconnected and interweaved. That is what we're up against. And the West is busy doing it's like, well, I report this way.
I was talking to someone last week about that, to your point, who said that we really should have a military force organized against four, not three types of warfare. Like we organize against, Navy, Army, and Air Force. We really should add cognitive to that because it's up there as something that is proven to be as effective and something that is flies under the radar before a lot of people recognize it.
Yeah. And so that it absolutely has to be. If you But here's the problem I've discovered is that if you identify cyber information and psyops as a domain of warfare, which it clearly is in 2025, but if you admit that, well, then you've got to admit that quite a few countries are at war with you.
Right. And nobody wants to do that because um, they don't want to upset their own populations.
Let's take Canada, for example. You'd have to admit that China has invaded you because they've invaded your information space. You'd have to admit that MAGA is at war with you. You'd have to admit that Russia is at war with you.
And that's a big threshold.
Mm, I would say so. Yeah, I would say that the military and the Canadian Armed Forces and security forces and government are very wary of identifying.
Definitions of that.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, and Canadians, I don't know, are terribly aware of it. I mean, we really have been impacted by cognitive warfare over the last
Yeah.
decade. I mean, to the point that, just in general discussions in this peaceful land, you hear a lot of people say, I don't know what to believe anymore, so I'm not going to believe anything.
That is the
Um,
point. That's the
yeah,
purpose of this.
of course
It's
it
not
is.
to persuade, well, it is to persuade, but it's also to make people feel disconnected, to cause dysfunction and chaos, and
See.
to cause a reduction in social cohesion.
Did Ukraine confront that same surrender from the population at some point?
Yeah. Um, but the difference is, so if I just go back to actually 2008, that was the first time that Russia used information warfare. And one of the other, I'm just going to put like this little pin. One of the issues we face in this, is in this domain, is that we don't have shared terminology. We don't have a lexicon that we've all agreed on. We don't have a system of naming what it is we're up. We've got all kinds of different names for it. So I'm going to call it information warfare. It was in 2008, against Georgia. This is the first time they deployed it. They developed it in 2004. They deployed it in 2008, and it proved to be extremely successful. And so when they invaded Ukraine in 2014, they deployed information warfare first. When they knew that they were losing Ukraine, when they knew that Yanukovych was on his way out, they deployed disinformation, information warfare first. That was the first point of their warfare. Then the little green men came in and the invasion began. But it was really, that was the point. And so the government in Ukraine at that point had a huge issue. Number one, their army and their police force, they had to get rid of all the Russian loyalists that were in it. And that absolutely killed so much of their resources and everything else. And they had to start from scratch. And the other thing is there were no resources to fight the disinformation and information warfare. So as that happened, so Azov, that I'm very
Which is
fond
one
of.
of the famous group
Yeah.
of people that Russia claimed were sort of Nazi sympathizers.
So the roots of Azov does come from the leader who put that together. And initially, it was a small band of civilians, football hooligans, actually. And I think if you look at any football hooligan around Europe, you'll find some interesting tattoos and beliefs. Um, and then they've developed from there. They are now a fully NATO compliant, probably the most professional and effective fighting force that Ukraine has, without a doubt. I love them. I work with their international desk. I work with they're fantastic people. They they haven't lost their civilian roots, so they have academics. In fact, one of the academics I work with is in this space, in information warfare space, because they've had to fight it. So in 2014, it was civilians who stood up. It was civilians who mobilized against the information warfare, and it was civilians who built networks of resilience, and it was civilian structures that started to push back and to fight. And so it's really grown from there. So the initial attacks that Russia did obviously were huge, especially to the Russian community, the Russian speaking community. Um,
Making them feel under threat,
yeah,
basically touching the nerves that already existed.
exactly. So with any information warfare campaign, there's always a grain of fact in there. It
Or
just
emotion.
or emotion, and then they build out from it. The one thing I will say is that they're very predictable. They work from 9 to 5. I'm not joking. So
The banking holidays.
yeah, so we did a study in Germany, and yeah, so they work from 9 to 5. So how do you know it's a troll farm? How do you know they're not real? Well, because they're active from 9 until 5. So
Predictable.
yeah. So there's lots of telltale, and the Russians don't deviate from their playbook. Very predictable. There is one individual who is very close to Putin, and he is in charge of the entire operation of all disinformation and information warfare.
So
Happened
it's
by
interesting. So these civilian groups then they began to monitor and began to see the patterns
yeah,
and what was predictable, what was typical to be able to separate them from, you know, genuine conversation versus artificially elevated
exactly.
conversation.
Inauthentic is a word that I think
Inauthentic. Yeah.
people really need to adopt. So people get caught up with this idea that, we're talking about freedom of speech. It's got nothing to do with freedom of speech. Nobody cares if Boris in Dnipro thinks Putin's a wonderful guy. Great, good for you. What we're talking about is inauthentic behavior. So that is where it isn't a real person, where it is a fake account, and where those are being manipulated. And the other thing you have to throw in there is the bribes that are used. So it's the paid agitators, it's the paid activists. And obviously in 2014, this wasn't just online, this was a kinetic attack
Right. It
as
was
well.
Crimea. It was how they were setting the stage for being able to grab that most southern part of Ukraine. Did it change once they could identify the patterns? Did was that the beginning of their understanding of how to defend themselves?
Yeah, so it's an education of the populace, an education of how to recognize bots, how to understand. But Ukrainians, the advantage they have is this is a very tech savvy nation. It always makes me giggle when I speak to Canadian diaspora who seem to think that this is still a 90s Ukraine. It's not. We have the most digital, like anybody I show around. I just had somebody coming from the European government last week was here, and I was helping introducing him to various folks, and he kept going on about, oh my God, we're so behind in Germany. We order at the table. There's a QR code on the table. It has our table number. You order whatever you want, and you pay at the table. Everything is digitized. Absolutely everything is digitized here, and the guys that are fighting on the front, most of them come from civilian walks of life. They're engineers, they're techs, they're software engineers, they're data scientists. So it was a relatively easy thing, I think, given that level of knowledge, to educate. And but it, that hasn't stopped. Now we've moved into very sophisticated psyops. One
Psychological operations.
Exactly. And so one of the focuses of the Russian disinformation, information warfare are veterans and also guys on the front. And so the messages that they are getting is things like, nobody cares about you if you're a veteran, you're not going to get any support, you're going to be betrayed, Zelensky's this, just to undermine what they're doing. And then obviously one of their favorites is that the Ukrainians are going around in vans and grabbing men off the street and throwing them into the van and throwing them on the front. That's constant every day.
It's not just the Russians, though. I mean, you mentioned MAGA, and we saw with this new U.S. administration how they were able to change the perception of Zelensky in a matter of weeks, among their supporters. I mean, he went from a hero defending his motherland to, an enemy who started the war. I mean, a complete 360. And then at the same time, we started to see here in Canada that same group of people all of a sudden saw Canada as an enemy nation, that we were sucking them out of their jobs and their livelihoods. And again, another 360, and obviously alarming to many of us here. What opportunity does that provide actors like Russia when you have the ability of one man and his followers to convince people to change their reality so quickly?
I think we have to look at the facts that are before our eyes and identify the fact that there is no doubt that Trump has Russian support and that all of the tactics that he uses in his information warfare against his own people and others is a Russian playbook. Like we can see it plain as day.
You
And
see the patterns that Ukraine had learned about earlier, and you see that people might be learning from them.
yeah, not just learning, but trained. There's no way that you can do what he's done, and it's been proven. I mean, the 2016, we know that Prigozhin had that troll farm. We know that it was supported. It's there. I mean, it's not arguable. In terms of what advantages, and when you create information bubbles, and Zelensky did say that to Trump, you're in an information bubble. What that means is that you as a person are not seeking alternate news sources. You're sitting on Facebook, you're reading the memes, you're hitting on the YouTube Connect, and you're getting just this information, this bubble, and nothing is questioning your perspective. And you're going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole. And what we look for is also the cross messaging, so the cross narratives. When we saw in July 2024 in Canadian information spaces, you were having Trump and MAGA messaging and names, and then Polyev was being messaged in there. And so you had this interconnected weave of Canadian and US narratives in specific channels, which you didn't see in independent channels. Independent bloggers were not doing that. They were focused on Canadian issues, and there was no infiltration of American stories. And that's one of the key things to look for is where what is the anomaly in this, and what are we seeing? And that's a breadcrumb you have to follow.
Try to draw the parallels between them. But as you say, like Canadians by and large don't realize that this has been going on for years.
No.
And that we are among the least defended NATO country to try to combat it at this point. Short of the kind of horrific war that Ukraine is enduring, what's it going to take to wake us up?
When you have a Green Man invasion in Alberta and Manitoba, I expect.
Explain what that is.
So Green Man invasion is where you would have right wing, far right, 6th of Januaryers joining your 3%ers and your other far right groups, and doing a Green Man invasion, taking over the airport, taking over bus stations, taking over train stations, hacking. It would also be a hybrid attack, so you would have hacking of the telecoms. All telecoms in North America, in America and Canada, have a back door that the Chinese can access. That is known.
So this is the tactic that Crimea endured. They weren't green; they were very large men who showed up without any sort of patch or identification, and all of a sudden started operating without identifying where they were from or what they were doing.
Yeah, and completely deniable. I was speaking to somebody who's a security expert today, actually at lunch, and and he was talking. He's had some experience with Canadian security and also with government in the last year. And he's like, these guys are not serious. They're not a serious country. He said, what do you think's going to happen when a Russian ship stops and plants a flag on your northern territories? What you going to do about it? And the answer from the deputy minister was, why would they do that? Well, because they want those
They can.
seawords. And what are you going to do about it? Because in our experience, whoever plants that flag, and they used Norway as an example of how they set up when they were occupied. They set up operations in a hotel in Norway, and because they didn't meet with any resistance, they're like, okay, in with the army now. So your first thing would be that. What are you going to do, Canada? There's a Russian flag on your northern territories. And of course, it would be accompanied with a huge hybrid warfare, including information warfare, cyber attacks, little green men suddenly appearing. The green men are deniable.
Mhm.
So far right Americans who are not tracked by your border control guys, they can cross regardless. They can have as much far right paraphernalia and proof that they're criminals, and they will not be stopped at the border. They will be allowed in. And
So
often,
when you speculate about this, um, what what informs your speculation? Is it what you saw in Ukraine? Is it the meetings that you're having with Canadians who seem clued out? What leads you to a scenario that many Canadians would think is not impossible but improbable?
it's based on the research we've done, the information we've tracked. I asked the guys to track the MAGA channels on the information space and to do a comparison. I think I sent that to you, and to do a comparison with independent bloggers and to identify. And there was 100% inauthentic behavior, which increased over time. It is to do with the information I get when I'm meeting about stuff I do for Ukraine. Um, for us sitting here, it's obvious. And yeah, I understand Canadians. I understand that this is unbelievable. But it's going exactly as has been seen before. These tactics, and
History echoes.
yeah, but we get to hear a lot of stuff here, and we listen. And I'm shocked and horrified that your security services are not doing their job. To be honest.
Well, you continue to live and work in a country where cognitive warfare is only one aspect of the strain on that society. Can you suggest a theory, therefore, of how important it is in the long run to rally a country around a threat to a common understanding of fact?
Well, it's easier in some ways in Ukraine because there's missiles landing on our heads. So the danger is very real and very present, and it has been since 2014 for Ukrainians. The guys I work with, they've all been fighting this war for 11 years and they're tired. Um, Perhaps it needs that. I don't know. I've spoken to British as well. I've spoken to Germans, and they all think that there are those that understand the threat and know it's real and have the intelligence and have the data points to prove it. And then there's this huge camp which refuses to accept it, refuses to believe in it until something happens. Now, obviously, you don't want that thing to happen, but maybe that's the only way people wake up. I mean, I've seen that Prime Minister Carney wants to do a defense industrial base, but what does that mean? And how are you going to do it when you have completely ignored the Ukrainian technology? I mean, Ukraine is where all of the defense technology is changing. And there isn't one Canadian doing anything out here. And I know that because I've tried for 3 years to get them in here
To learn.
to learn, to do joint ventures, joint programs, to learn. I mean, D&D, CAF don't even have an FPV drone. They don't even have one to train on. They don't have one in their hands. They don't have an optic fiber FPV. It's mind blowing. So what would
Especially
it
when you
take?
see what you see.
Exactly? I mean, we're surrounded by it. You know, nightly visits with Shahid and stuff. And also, you know, we're seeing the speed with which technology moves forward. It's incredible. Um, it changes. I mean, the Shaheeds now are much harder to hit. They're faster. They've got
Those are
better.
the Iranian-made drones
They're
that
being made
missed.
in Russia now as well.
Oh, okay.
And there's a new Russian long-range drone as well now that is fast and much improved. It's
The pace of innovation is at the digital pace. It's not
huge.
at the
Yeah,
bureaucratic pace.
yeah. It's so fast.
Well, Kate, thank you for your time. I hope you get some rest tonight.
Thank you.
And so much to absorb, think about, and fret about.
Yeah,
In a
sorry.
country as peaceful and lovely as Canada.
Yeah, I love Canada. I really do. My daughters are Canadian, so I'm invested. I'm just a bit pissed off right now, to be honest, because I don't feel like it's being taken seriously. But thank you for the work that you're doing and your
All
team.
right. Well, thank you for your work. And we'll chat again soon. Take care.
Thank you.